Welcome to the Learning Together live webinar series as part of Lifelong Learning Initiatives presented by Trinity University's Office of Alumni Relations. I'm Charlene Davis, Professor of Marketing and Chair of the Department of Business Administration. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's webinar speaker, Dr. Mario Gonzalez-Fuentes, my colleague who is an Assistant Professor of Marketing. As part of his commitment to create global citizens and professionals, Dr. Gonzalez actively participates in the organization of a number of faculty-led study abroad programs at Trinity. He has been literally around the globe, Vietnam, Cuba, Shanghai, and the Japan summer programs. For over a decade, his industry experience focused on the creation and dissemination of content, knowledge, and ideas through multiple platforms and channels in Europe. In 2009, Dr. Gonzalez founded the Strategic Research Center of EAE Business School, which has become a pivotal reference point in the public dissemination of applied business research in Madrid, Spain. Dr. Gonzalez received his Ph.D. in applied economics from Universidad de Alcalá in Spain. His research interests address the adaptation of consumers to different social environments and contexts. So, in today's webinar discussion, you will learn the following. 1, the difference between Japanese and American millennial consumers' materialistic and ethnocentric views. You'll also learn how globalization is affecting the consumer identities of millennials in Japan and America, and what patterns of adaptation to the global cultures are discernible between these two different cultures. So please know that you will be able to submit your questions as you listen to Dr. Gonzalez, and he will be happy to answer them following his presentation. So ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mario Gonzalez-Fuentes.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Charlene. About a year and a half ago, Dr. Davis was here present, Dr. Kim Robertson, and I started a research which is still ongoing and it's a work in progress, so be on the lookout in the future for some insights, very interesting insights that we're finding on that research. But as part of that research, we asked our students, two simple questions. One was, in your own words, what do you understand by the term globalization? And a follow-up question that asked them, can you give us examples that illustrate that globalization as you just described it? The quote that you see on your screens is the one that stood out the most from the bunch of responses that we collected back then. And you got to understand that we had a wide array of different responses, right? We had all the way from the ones that were very sort of functional and utilitarian aspects of globalization to the other side of the spectrum, which were more humanistic aspects of globalization, exchange of ideas, people, etc. This one stood out the most because, it tended to be more on the humanistic side, but because when I read the stuff about the traffic, I'm like, where? So I went to the demographics that we collected, and it turned out that it was an exchange student from Seoul, from South Korea. So that was kind of my motivation to start thinking about this research that I'm presenting today, and it was this international comparison in the ways that students, or millennials in this case, understand globalization and how they're being shaped by globalization. So also that quote allows me to introduce the term globalization and also frame it within this research. On the one hand, globalization is a very complex phenomenon. It's a set of processes that encompass, global economic, cultural, political, business aspects of today's everyday lives and societies and institutions. It spans beyond the nation-state boundaries and so forth and so on. In particular, I'm a marketer and I study consumers and marketplaces. So this study addresses the globalization from the point of view of marketplaces and the way that globalization forces are shaping individuals as consumers in these marketplaces. So I thought that it was a good idea to make a remark about that and that observation.
Mario, do you mind if I ask a question? What is the particular interest in millennials as a generational cohort, either as a driver of your research, or why are marketers interested in them?
That's a great question. On the one hand, from a marketing perspective, millennials as a generation is a very important generation because of the challenges that this generation is sending to marketers. They're more fickle consumers than previous generations. Research out there also points out to they are wealthier. They have more resources, at least from the parental aspects of their household. Also, they have different expectations when it comes to labor market. So from a general perspective, they're very different from other generations at those stages. In my case, my research deals with identity issues. And so studying identity issues in a population such as the age at which millennials, our students, are in, is a very productive avenue. Because of their identity's influx, you can see those changes and record them as they're happening and understand a little bit more of those changes. But millennials are an important kind of cohort and segment. If you see it from other disciplines, it's marketing that my discipline, the one that I know why they are very important. And so like I was saying, my research deals or addresses issues of identity, more precisely issues of consumer identity. Within identity, when you study these issues, depending on the model that you're using, you may encounter that there are different levels of a person's identity, ranging from social identity, more personal, ego identity, again, depending on the model that you use. I am very interested in that layer of social identity, the part of ourselves that associate or dissociate with certain groups. These groups can be very large, like our country, like Americans or Japanese or Mexicans, but it could also be very micro, a niche, sort of consumer that has very idiosyncratic preferences or fandom, all those different things. So I'm interested in social identity and in part in consumer identity, but I'm very interested in instances in which this consumer identity is in flux, is being challenged by changes in the social and cultural landscape of consumers. So there are two ways to see this. On the one hand, there are situations in which consumers go towards this change, and there are situations in which change comes towards consumers. My dissertation explores issues of immigration and how immigrants are cultivated as consumers in the host societies or the receiving societies. And so that is an example of the first area, right? Like how when consumers go towards change, they voluntarily, to a certain extent, go towards this change, this new culture, this new society. This study actually addresses the other side of the coin. When change comes to consumers, to their villages, to their marketplace, to their local marketplaces, and how they react, right? So in a way, I'm looking at those two sides of the coin, especially with this research. I think it's pertinent to say at this point that in this debate of globalization that we were talking about, there are two ends of this debate. On the one hand, you have scholars that maintain that globalization is actually having a standardizing force. They're homogenizing consumers across the globe, meaning consumers are converging in terms of their tastes and preferences. They're buying the same brands, they're buying the same products, the same quantities. There's an interesting article about how breakfast habits are converging, around the globe. On the other end of the spectrum, you have positions or scholars maintaining that globalization is actually having a more of a resistant response, and people are becoming more regional or more local as a result of this force that they're trying to resist or contain, right? And so it's very interesting to see these two debates at the same time. And so I guess part of this research, I think the background for this research is those two polarities in the debate.
And trying to reconcile those.
Absolutely, right? Because I personally, and this is my editorial comment, like I just don't like purely one. I think both sides of the debate have very good points, but I'm sort of always a middle point kind of guy. Within consumer identity, there are two features that are very often associated with the internationalization of markets, with the globalization of consumers. And those two features or characteristics of consumer identity that are often associated are the degree of materialism and the degree of consumer ethnocentrism. Materialism is, an attitudinal outcome that measures how much we value possessions in our life, how we feel that possessions are important in our lifestyles or lives. On the other hand, consumer ethnocentrism is the degree to which consumers would favor or prefer more regional, local marketing offerings, right? We would prefer domestic, products to international products, right? My research on these aspects of consumer identity led me to a model recently published in 2015, and for which I have the reference at the end of my presentation. The authors in this research presented materialism and consumer ethnocentrism as independently determined by consumers' levels of ethnic identity and consumers' degree of acculturation to the global consumer culture. I took this model as my framework, and I took ethnic identity as an indicator of national identity issues, and the acculturation to global, what the authors call acculturation to global consumer culture, as my indicator for global identity. So I'm interested in seeing how materialism and consumer ethnocentrism separately are shaped by consumers' national and global identities for both Japanese and for Americans.
And I know you're going to talk a little bit about your research instrument, but just from a more practical standpoint, how would something like materialism or consumer ethnocentrism manifest? So what would it look like on the part of an individual?
Great. Yes, materialism, in the literature on materialism, at least in marketing, we know it pretty well. Ross Belk, etc. Basically, materialism would be shown in how we as consumers use possessions and products or services as signs of status, success, and things like that. In terms of talking a little bit more about maybe part of the instrument that I use, the statements that the people were asked to respond to, had statements such as, "I sort of feel sad when I can't buy the things that I want," right? Or I believe that having possessions in my life is important, etc. So that's what how materialism, I think, manifests in people.
So it's not simply that we're buying a lot of things,
No.
it's just how we value and see those as part of our overall identity?
Absolutely, and that is a great distinction, because most people think of materialism in terms of like, oh yeah, I like to buy stuff. No, it goes beyond that. Is how I see possessions as part of my life and how they bring value for me to distinguish myself from some groups than others, or to signal certain things that in the marketplace are important. Like, I have money, so you can give me a loan, right? Or things like that.
I just saw your economist side come out, signal,
Yeah,
marketplace signal.
Marketplace signals, yeah. And then on the other hand, ethnocentrism, I think, is typical of, or very salient when we prefer to buy made in, fill in the blank, America, made in Mexico, made in Japan, when we prefer sort of like that, local flair on our products. That's more the consumer ethnocentric. When you say like, no, I prefer, a global brand that, doesn't have a local or regional sort of inflection or aspect, then you are less ethnocentric, etc. So I used this model, and what I did was I went through the research available, and I found 4 instruments, and I adopted those 4 instruments from previous studies. These instruments have been validated in the literature through many years, through many applications, through many cultures in different languages. So validation is over the board, in those instruments. I took 4 instruments. They are measuring materialism, consumer ethnocentrism, and then as you can see in your screen, ethnic identity, which is my indicator of national identity, and acculturation to global consumer culture. I'll be calling that global identity in short. The nice thing about these instruments is that for the case of national identity and global identity, they were subcategorized to capture sort of the hues of those two very complex constructs, ethnic identity or national identity and global identity. And so I use those subcomponents in my model in order to see sort of the differences between the two cultures. For those of you who are watching and are not acquainted with what an instrument is or so, an instrument is a series of statements that we give respondents on a survey, and we ask them to evaluate them on a 7-point Likert scale, all the way from strongly agree to strongly disagree, right, whether they agree or not with the statement in question. Groups of statements, we call them constructs, are supposed to assess certain dimensions, in this case, these 4 dimensions, or more so if you're looking at the subcomponents of national and global identity. I put them together in a survey, encompassing, I think it was a total, if you count the numbers, on your screen, it's like 91 or 92 statements in total, packaged it in a survey, sent it to 500 college students, 250 from Japan and 250 from Americans. We got back 422 useful responses, which means completed questionnaires. 244 of them from Japanese students, 178 from American students. That also shows you how well Japanese students listen to their professors when they ask them to, answer a survey, and how not that well American students. Food for thought for other research out there, those of you who are interested. We received these responses, and for those of you who are interested in the reliability of these instruments, we use Cronbach's alpha, standard criteria, and all of these different statements and constructs and instruments pass, with flying colors, the Cronbach alpha reliability test.
So that's just a way to ensure that the instrument is measuring what you think it's measuring.
Thank you. Yes, Cronbach's alpha or reliability means, is this instrument really measuring what you're supposed to be measuring? It correlates correctly with the other statements. And the answer was yes. So all of them had that criteria met. So here, let's get to the meat of things, right? I run separate models for materialism, for both Japanese and American, and then I run also another model with consumer ethnocentrism as my dependent variable, my outcome, the one that I wanted to explain, with both elements of national identity and global identity as independent or explanatory variables, right? So in your screen, you're looking at what the model looks like, sort of. Materialism is in the center of things. I'm trying to explain materialism, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, you see rectangles. Those are the elements of global identity that I showed you in the previous slide. On the left side of your screens, you got ovals or circles. Those are representing national identity elements. And so this is what happens when we ran our model for Japan, right? So the gray rectangles or the gray ovals mean or denote variables that are not statistically significant. What does that mean? It means that the model regards those variables as not contributing to the explanation of materialism in the case of Japanese millennials. Only 3 variables are significant or important in the explanation of materialism. Notice it's only 1 rectangle and 2 ovals, meaning 2 elements of Japanese millennials' national identities versus only 1 element of their global identities. The fact that they're green shaded means that they have positive effects, meaning the more identified with the global consumer culture Japanese millennials are, meaning the more influence they see the global consumer culture is having on their lifestyle choices of fashion, decor, etc., the more materialistic views they have, the more ethnic their personal networks are, the more Japanese center or focus their personal networks are, the more materialistic, the more Japanese or ethnic their media consumption is in terms of the outlets they use, the more Japanese media outlets they use in their media consumption, the more materialistic they are. So because there's 2 of the components of national identity and only 1 of global identity, this I argue in this paper, I argue that for Japanese millennials, materialism is more of I'm going to use very liberal language here, but in the sense of a very endogenous process, in the sense that it is engendered by elements of their national identities, of what they understand as their own culture, more so than what's coming from the global culture. So more endogenous, more internal sort of process. The picture for Americans is the opposite, right? We have two rectangles, one oval, meaning materialism is an attitudinal outcome that for American millennials is explained more so by their global identities and less so by their national identities. This is more of a reaction to an external force, and how their identities are changing because of those external forces. And again, green shaded positive effects on those variables. I did the same for consumer ethnocentrism, right? I run with these 10 variables. For those fans of Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. The right side of your screen, just refreshing your memory, right side of the screen, we got global identity elements. The left side of your screen, you have national identity elements. Japan.
My.
Right? Talk about consumer ethnocentrism being a more complex and multifaceted phenomena compared to materialism, which seem much more, much simpler. Only 3 variables, right? If you remember, this. Let's count them: 1, 2, 3, 4 ovals. 4 national identity elements are statistically significant. 3 out of the 5 global identity elements are statistically significant. Green shaded squares rectangles or ovals are positive effects. Negative effects are denoted by red shaded items, right? So again, first of all, that's the first difference. Consumer ethnocentrism is a much more complex phenomena in Japan, right? Among Japanese millennials. I want to point out to 3 of these variables that have what we call unexpected direction of effects. I want you to pay attention to openness to the global consumer culture and global mass media exposure. They both are green shaded, meaning indicating positive effects. So in a way, this means the more open, the more tolerant the Japanese millennial is to the inclusion of global consumer culture in their lifestyles, the more ethnocentric they are with their consumption. The more exposed to global mass media the Japanese millennial is, also the more ethnocentric. I know how this sounds, right?
Yeah, that would seem to be a contrast.
Right, it would be the opposite, right? So it's the same for, if you pay attention to the ethnic interpersonal relationship, red shade, it means that the more Japanese their personal network, the less ethnocentric, the other way around, the more diverse their personal networks, the more ethnocentric. Again, this sort of paradoxical or, counterintuitive in a way. Well, if we go back to the debate of globalization that we were talking about, these two sort of ends, the standardization, homogenization of culture versus the heterogenization of, or localization of cultures, I argue in this paper that these sort of counterintuitive results are actually the resistance, right? The resistant forces at play here, right? The Japanese millennial, by feeling more tolerant or, perceiving more tolerance in the way that they include global consumer culture in their lifestyle choices, by being more exposed to global mass media, they resisting those forces by becoming more ethnocentric, by adding more local inflections in their consumption. On the other hand, too, the more diverse they feel that the personal networks are becoming, the more ethnocentric they
So it's almost
become.
like protecting their sense of identity and self?
Correct, right? Or trying to distinguish from the rest in those sort of inflections or flares or, tweaks in their consumption. But yeah, I take it more as a resistant, as a sign of resistance to this globalization. And this is interesting because then, we're sort of trying to find a marriage in between or a consensus in between these two. There are, I guess I would agree now, after these results that there are resisting forces on the one side of the debate, but also there is some homogenization and standardization happening. It only gets interesting when we look at Americans. So, the complexity sort of disappears, very simple, only rectangles, or simpler at least than Japanese. Only rectangles are significant, meaning only global identity elements are important for Americans. We also see resistance at play here. The green rectangle of self-identification. The more influence the American millennial feels the global consumer culture is having in their lifestyle choices, decor, shopping, fashion, the more they react with, consumption that has parochial or local inflections, right? So again, also these resistant forces at play with American millennials, however, in a much simpler explanation. What I asked after this, what I asked the model to perform for me was I asked it to run a cluster analysis or cluster algorithm. Cluster analysis is basically an algorithm that tries to lump together a whole mass of data points according to similarity. So basically, you're asking the algorithm, are there any groups that look that are similar within each other, but it's sufficiently different between one another that you can find in this mass of data? And so, of course, to find similarity or affinity, you need to feed the algorithm with, okay, so where do you want me to look for this affinity and similarity? And so I use my two start variables, consumer ethnocentrism and materialism. And so let me help you a little bit, understanding the speedometers that I use there. So the speedometers are supposed to be showing you how the intensity of materialism and consumer ethnocentrism in the clusters. First of all, the cluster algorithm finds two distinct clusters in each subsample, Americans and Japanese, right? Let's look first at the case of Americans, and let me help you see what are the differences. Look at the speedometers of Americans, and you can see that there are basically two distinct segments in America. The ones that consider themselves materialistic, and the ones that neither agree nor disagree with the statement that they are materialistic. And so you have, on the one hand, materialistic and non-materialistic. But also when you look and pair them with their consumer ethnocentric intensities, ethnocentrism intensities, you see that the one that even though that both are scoring low on consumer ethnocentrism, either neither agree nor disagree or low on those values, one of them has higher consumer ethnocentrism, and those are the ones that are also materialistic. So on the one hand, we can talk about a cluster of American millennials that they consider themselves materialistic and also evince more ethnocentric consumption than the other segment, which do not consider themselves materialistic and definitely not ethnocentric. Japanese millennials, both of them consider themselves materialistic. No question about it. They both clusters see themselves as materialistic. Actually, if you look, I can show you the numbers to whomever is interested. I can send them the paper and look at the numbers. But trust me when I tell you that the numbers for materialistic views on Japanese are at the same level as the highest materialistic views on, or the cluster with the highest materialistic views on Americans, right? So that's, I think, also an interesting result right there. And so that's how you distinguish between the Japanese. And you got equally materialistic, but some of them are more ethnocentric and some of them are less ethnocentric.
Mario, what does that, in terms of the materialistic, non-materialistic, what kind of practical outcome does that have for marketers? How does this help them make better decisions?
Interesting. In the paper, I wrote a couple of implications for that result. And so on the one hand, you have Americans seem to be more, with divergent pathways in terms of materialism and consumer ethnocentrism. So it means that they're very well segmented in those two areas. So when you're an institution and you want to send out messages or communication messages out there that may want to appeal to millennials, I would say that you will need to be very mindful and very careful with how you package that communication to know that what you're going to be telling one group may not resonate on the other group. So you may need to talk about two different aspects of your message when it comes to how ethnocentric that message may sound or how materialistic they sound, right? So segmentation of communication messages. On the other hand, in the case of Japan, they're both considered materialistic. So you'll be okay if your communications are more on that side, highlighting possessions as a sign of status or possession as a sign of values or that add value to people's lifestyle, etc., with some sort of tweak on the consumer ethnocentric. Which is interesting. Also, you mentioned that because there is a part of the results that I'm, because of space and time, not showing. And I also did these cluster analysis algorithm for the elements of global identity and the elements of national identity. No big differences for Japan and America in terms of clusters. The only difference that the algorithm shows is but for Japanese millennials, in terms of global identity, they found two segments. One segment that was not very acculturated to the global consumer culture, had low global identities. One segment that had high global identity, but both of those segments were highly cosmopolitan. In other words, these two groups acknowledge the fact that they were in different parts of the spectrum. Some of them were not that globally acculturated. Some of them were very globally acculturated, but they were both very interested, because that's what cosmopolitanism measures, very interested in learning about other cultures, etc. So, and bear that result in mind for the next slide. So one thing I want to point out also in this slide before we move on to the last slide is of results is that so you can see that there are two clusters that are similar in between Japanese millennials and American. Cluster number one, right? Both these clusters are identifying individuals that are sort of more ethnocentric than their counterparts, but also materialistic. So this cluster is illustrating the consumers that are more resistant, right? They're showing the highest consumer ethnocentric views, meaning more resistant to globalization and with a high level of materialism. So what I did was I asked the software to plot this in a graph. Now notice the graph has two axes. The vertical axis is showing the level of global identity, acculturation to global consumer culture. Low levels of global identity means that consumers are global identities are low. High levels means that they are very much acculturated to the global consumer culture, and the same for national identity, which is depicted on the horizontal axis, right? Look for the squares. The squares are the data points that are representing those clusters. Cluster number one that I showed you in the previous slide. These graphs are supposed to be emulating a very famous matrix, very famous among nerds like me that study acculturation. John W. Barry, a psychologist, in a couple of seminal papers in the 90s, came up with this matrix. This matrix explores the degree of importance for an immigrant to keep their original culture or not to keep their original culture when they emigrate, but also to the degree of importance to adopt the new culture, the receiving or host culture, or not adopt that culture, right? So in a very simplistic, framework, Barry condensed these possibilities in 4 strategies, right? Depending on whether people would keep their original culture or shed it, or also adopt or prefer not to adopt the new culture, right? So you got 4 strategies over there. Those 4 squares are supposed to emulate also the 4 quadrants in my graphs up there. So one thing I want to point out too in Japan, if you look at the squares, like I said, cluster number 1 in Japan, you'll see that there is a concentration of those data points on the upper right corner of the graph, which indicates that Japanese millennials tend to favor or prefer more integrative strategies, where they in a way follow a more hybridization model. They balance their global identities with their national identities. They allow both of them to kind of intermingle. And, I ran tests, confidence intervals, and you can see that the proportion of dots on that corner is statistically significant, different to 0.5. So it's not a coin toss. It's actually, there's a preference right there. For Americans on the left side, the confidence interval on the dots are pretty much evenly split. For Americans, there is a group of them that have the same sort of strategies as Japanese counterparts. They are looking for harmonizing ways, integrative ways. But there's also an equal proportion of consumers, millennials, that are leaning more towards more separatist strategies. Strategies that are more towards the segregation of saying, like, to globalization, in the face of globalization, I react with, local inflections in my consumption. I become regional. I become local. I prefer local products, and to enact also those identities, more of the national identity side of things, which I found it, revealing, and in terms of the different strategies that these consumers show. So just recapping, as a matter of, finishing up. Remember, one of the things that we learned, materialism is a much simpler process than consumer ethnocentrism, at least for Japanese, for sure. It is more endogenous or internal, generated more from the inside the culture in Japan. In America, is more a response to external forces. In terms of consumer ethnocentrism, is much more complex for Japanese. Consumer ethnocentrism is much more complex phenomena than materialism, but also much more complex than in America. Among American millennials, it seems to be more a response to also external forces, global identity, and a simpler process. And finally, the strategies that we talked about. Japanese millennials are edging more towards integrative, harmonizing strategies. American millennials are more split. So you have more opportunities for segmentation right there among American millennials when it comes to local versus global consumption. These are my references, and I can send them to whoever is interested in. Thank you very much. Arigato gozaimasu, as they would say in Japan, and I would welcome your questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Mario. I always love your enthusiasm for whatever research topic that you have. Let's look at a couple of the questions that have come in. So Tom asks, does your definition of materialism include choices in dining, music, and other activities, or you focus mainly on tangible material possessions?
Thank you for that question. And yes, I did not include those differences, or the statements that I used did not include those differences between food and different other aspects. These were more general worded statements. I would love to do that, but for that, I feel like I either need to develop myself those instruments and then validate them, so it's more of a longer route on research in that way, or find somebody who has already validated those instruments and try to see how can I adopt it. But that's a great follow-up for the research.
A good future research topic,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm just thinking about some of the, especially food in the United States, the movement towards, local and sourcing. You might find some interesting differences there.
That's true.
So, next question. Based on your answer, this is a follow-up. Do you see differences in consumer activity between activities, something that's more visible to peers, and things that may not be as visible? So items that are publicly consumed or privately consumed?
That's also a great question, and I'm afraid I
think you have a research partner here.
I know, yeah, I'm taking notes, Tom, thanks. But though the quick answer is no, I cannot distinguish between those two. I think that is a great research question. So one thing that this is not a new topic in the sense that other researchers have studied materialism and consumer ethnocentrism, etc. And the contribution of my study here is that I sort of took magnifying lenses on materialism and consumer ethnocentrism in terms of global and local or national identities. There is a wide array of research out there, and I invite you guys to check them out, in which they explore consumer ethnocentrism and materialism as they have effects on behaviors, right? So what I did was sort of the intermediate step before you get to behaviors, and so there is a lot of research out there that is trying to extrapolate to what degree materialism and consumer ethnocentrism in different cultures affect the consumption of things such as restaurants or food or intangible versus tangible products. I haven't gotten to that part. I'm stuck here in the middle, of looking at magnifying glasses or lenses on materialism and consumer ethnocentrism.
So a little more on the attitude side, and then the behavioral piece,
piece
is next.
That's right.
Okay, good. We have a question from Logan. Do we care why, or just that this is happening? If we're concerned with why, are we considering things like environmental factors, for example, shipping containers across the ocean, the planet, et cetera?
We do care about the why, and I think this study, for me, it just scratches the surface of this issue. It's just the tip of the iceberg. I hope, that will we a productive research agenda right there. But no, absolutely, I care about the why, and we were commenting before the webinar started that I'm going to Japan this summer after going to Shanghai with a faculty-led study abroad program that we have in Shanghai. And I'm going to Japan because another research that spun off of this data is I am looking at intergenerational differences among the Japanese sample. I have about 300 data points from people that were born before the 90s, and especially focus on the people who were born right after World War II and the period that we call the Japanese economic miracle. And so, the why on the landscape, the environmental factors, I'm totally interested in the environmental factors of how the perception of sustainability and environment has changed from a Japanese society that was all about growing and putting up with often during the 80s you see records, historical records, that they were talking about rich Japan, poor Japanese, because they were experiencing the negative outcomes of growth, like pollution and this and that. So I'll be very interested in seeing those intergenerational differences to understand a little bit of the why of the differences.
Good. Trevor asks, given the increasing role of data like this in appealing to voters, are you ever interested in exploring the political applications of your conclusion? Which, thank you very much. I had that question in my mind as well. Because you can see some parallels, certainly in the results from the United States.
Yeah, I have a curious mindset, and I have so many questions about this data and the follow-up data that I have collected. I want to know every single implication. Actually, and going back to one of the original questions, there is more research done in terms of consumer ethnocentrism and materialism and, in the behavioral aspects of things. So I'm not that interested in, going into that realm, because there's a lot of competition already in that sense, and a lot that we have learned about it. I'm more interested in all those other applications of things that we are also purchasing or voting with our votes or with our dollars or with other things that are not maybe related to consumer behavior, but more to behavior and political ideas that we decide to support, or even just these ideas of social identity. Where do you belong to? Vaccination versus anti-vaccination, and all these different ideas and groups around. And how does that determine which side of the debate you are and things like that. So.
Well, and I think one of the nice things for us as researchers at a school like Trinity, we are not just funneled into one narrow area and have the opportunity to do something interdisciplinary, so work with colleagues in political science and sociology in terms of answering some of those questions that are beyond just a strict marketing scope.
Absolutely. When I came to Trinity in 2011 as a visiting assistant professor, I made the point that every year I was going to make some time to go and attend classes of other professors. And so I tried to reach out to other departments and go to other classes in other departments. Actually, this is a shout out to Dr. Kathleen Denny, who taught the Sociology of the Self course about 2 years ago, and I was a student in her class. She allowed me to audit that class, and her class gave me all the background to understand identity issues and the ones that I'm using for this. So absolutely, one of the wonders of being here at Trinity as a faculty is that I get to talk about these issues with a wide array of colleagues from our department, but from other departments, and they pitch in with their ideas, and it's just make you feel very passionate also about your research because it has relevance in other disciplines too.
So you are a lifelong learner yourself.
I am a lifelong learner myself. Yes, this year I've been busy, so I didn't audit any class, but next year for sure.
Oh. Well, we have a follow-up question from Tom. Based on many years living in Japan, I think global, or more specifically Asian consumer interaction, is having a clear impact on political relationships. The blending of ethnicities in K-pop and J-pop, for example, is developing positive common understanding.
It is true. I completely agree with your argument, Tom. And another strand of research that I'm very interested in terms of Japan is, and that I share to a certain extent with other colleagues at Trinity, is this interesting topic of pop culture and how globalization is sort of shaping pop culture, and how we use pop culture in different cultures and different societies as a soft power. Will Tsutsui, we had him a couple of years here visiting us, gave a great talk about globalization and Japanese pop culture. So it's interesting to see how K-pop, pop coming from Korea, is flooding, Asian markets, and how also some would say that China is also trying to develop a sort of soft power in terms of their pop cultures to see if they could also influence the culture around the world. In America, we've done it, Hollywood and the TV shows that we import and etc. outside. That's how we take pop culture abroad, and we use that also as a soft power to have our culture to be widespread around the world, right? So that's an interesting take on, and that in fact that is one of the things that I want to record or observe this summer. This summer, I'm not that not pressed on the data collection aspect as I was last summer in Japan. I spent a summer there, a month and a week with an undergraduate student here from Trinity, Chrissy, if you're watching this, a shout out to Chrissy Nielsen. She was fantastic. She came with me to Japan for the full month. She designed the survey, made sure that the survey was online, also in physical copies. She collected the data, put it in a database. Fantastic. We learned from each other a lot in terms of how we were looking at the different instruments. This year, if all goes well, I'm more interested in looking for partnerships of Japanese higher education institutions and scholars that would be able to, bring that perspective that, Tom has, because he has lived so many years in Japan. I haven't lived in Japan. I lived, a month, every year for the past 2-3 years. And I need that counterpart, that I need that perspective in my research, at least.
One thing that might be interesting is, would you talk a little bit about, at a place like Trinity, we talk about this balance between our teaching, our professional lives, and our research. Can you talk a little bit about how the stream of research developed, and basically, how did you get to Japan as part of your data collection? So why there?
Right. So as you mentioned, I've been in the majority of faculty-led study abroad programs here at Trinity. So I at the beginning of my career, I visited different cultures, and my interest, as you know, has always been international. I teach international marketing here at Trinity, so has always been in cross-cultural marketing, etc. So my dissertation is, like I said earlier, immigration and acculturation, right? So there was the kernel, right, of this comparison between cultures right there in my dissertation. But as I started traveling to these different places and got to know more scholars and documenting myself, I stumbled across the case of Japan. And to me, Japan has always been, from the point of view of international marketing, that is one of the things that most international marketing textbooks say, is that Japan, and to a certain extent now South Korea, is a sui generis, sort of example. It's different in many different aspects of marketing. And so I became interested in Japan, and the more that we started traveling, Dr. Nishikawa in the Center for International Engagement, we both opened the first Japan program. And the more we started traveling, I got more interested in their case study. I'm interested in Japan because this dichotomy between an economic model that was successful to a certain extent, and then what they call the lost decades after the 90s, and how they've been failing to grow sustainably and positively for quite a couple of years now. So I'm interested in this idea of how does the social psyche, or how the social identity from the consumer point of view changes when you have generations that are brought up in different circumstances. I did my Ph.D. in Spain, and I happened to live the crisis in Spain in the year 2007, 2008. I arrived here at Trinity in 2011. So I am very much close to the seeing with my own eyes the creation of these lost decades, and in some cases, sadly, lost generations. And so that's where my mind was, in those years. And when I stumbled across the case of Japan, was for me, a really interesting case. It sort of rendered itself because I was already studying consumer identity. But it's funny, you mentioned because of the research stream, the more I think about my research, and boy, we think about our research a lot. And she's not going to let me lie. She's my boss, my chair. Every year we have to write an SPA, which stands for Summary of Professional Activities. And we're invited and encouraged to think about the progress of our scholarship and where is it going, teaching, research, etc. So the more I see the paths that my teaching has taken and my research that is just entangling with each other, the more I realize that my research was about identity, like I said at the beginning. I didn't know those things, or I was not able to articulate it that, I guess, clearly 6-7 years ago. To me, what are you studying? I'm studying immigration and acculturation. But the more I started digging into these topics, I felt, I'm studying consumer identity. At the beginning, I said, I am interested in when consumer goes to change, and when change comes to consumer. Another strand of research and teaching that that I have also incorporated is storytelling. The best stories are about change. Boring story doesn't have change, it's just flat. Best stories are about change. Either the protagonist goes to change, or change comes to the protagonist. So to me, it's like full circle, right? I'm looking at when consumers go to change, or change goes to consumers. I'm looking at consumer narratives, at consumer stories. Right?
So what are you excited to do next?
Go to China and Shanghai with our 11 students that we recruited for this year. I'm excited for the trip to Japan and to find collaborations among Japanese higher ed institutions. I am excited for exploring more on the storytelling side of things with my teaching, and I have already, done that. I'm also excited about making connections in Shanghai and China to see if we can do a comparison between, like we did for Japan and America, maybe incorporating, Chinese college students for this piece, or also other segments, demographic segments for other future pieces. So if anybody out there who's interested in adding more cultures, call me.
Always good to get a plug in, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just in
I'm a
case.
marketer, so.
So, well, I think we're coming up to the close. So first I want to thank you for attending this live webinar. The next webinar is scheduled for May 22nd at noon Central Time, and it features Matt Swinney, class of '98. Matt is the founder of Austin Fashion Week, Fashion X Dallas, and Fashion X Houston. And in very typical Trinity small world syndrome, Matt was one of my first students when I came to Trinity 21 years ago. So Matt will lead a conversation on the changing face of fashion weeks, connecting designers direct to consumers. Thanks for joining us again.
Have a good weekend.